4 films in there, so maybe 2 to 3 pages per analysis, because a lot of these films they have 1 or 2 good points, but they don't require like a 30-page analysis. So anyway, so that's what it is. It's dealing with all of that, as well as, you know, maybe deep state power players having a say-so or an emphasis in film. And actually, I got that not from conspiracy stuff, but there's actually several academic publications on that topic going back about 15, 20 years. Really after 9/11, academia started publishing texts about the way that movies promote geopolitical agendas with the liaison offices of various military attaches, or CIA, the Army, the Navy. They all have these offices that consulted with how films would be produced. But post Big 9 event, we actually saw more and more intentional recruitment, even for the CIA through Hollywood. And they were very public about that. It's not a conspiracy theory. They had a lot of actors, a lot of Hollywood people kind of signed on to do a lot of PR and promotional stuff, because we got to fight this, war on terror and all that. So that was a big key time period in the 2000s for that kind of stuff. We eventually saw things like Zero Dark 30 and the American Sniper and all of these, which were really closely consulted on by State Department, CIA, Pentagon. And it's very obvious, I think, once we know this, we can see how much propaganda is in these movies. But for those that are not aware, you kind of people don't know about this. People don't know how many A-listers, for example, were this is declassified in the National Archives, were actually spies. Marlene Dietrich, Cary Grant, all of these people, Jimmy Stewart with the FBI. There's a long history of this. And I just found all that fascinating, and figured that it all kind of ties together even to today with, there's examples of entire studios being created as intelligence fronts. So it's a really deep rabbit hole. It's fascinating, and few people know this.
That's really interesting. And as a tangent, when you say they're really open about it, for someone who was in the academia and who spoke, for me, it's Russian. For other people, it would have been another Slavic language. They're pretty open about recruiting right from the academia. You would go to a history conference where everyone talks about their super niche, nerdy subject, and
right.
There's, booths for different publishers, and then there is a nice booth for the triple letter agency recruiting you right there. And this would be, if you're a Canadian flying to the major conference in the US, and Canada would be something like CSIS, doing the exact same thing, very much in the open. As long as you speak one of these languages, especially Russian, we don't want you in the academia. We want you, working for the government and using your linguistic skills for the benefit of those particular countries. So that always fascinated me too. It was a little bit shocking to me, because I didn't expect to, come to a history conference and be like, oh, well, hello there too, so that's interesting. So I'd like you to, since you keep mentioning these intelligence agencies and you talk about the more recent impact on film, but also, someone like Marlene Dietrich in the past, what about the world of art? I think you talked about that as well, in terms of, abstract expressionism and having that connection to sort of undermine certain social structures. What is your view on that trajectory?
Yeah, there was a famous academic, Frances Stoner Saunders. She wrote a book about the CIA and the Cold War. And her lectures are on YouTube. You can watch her C-SPAN, book talk TV or whatever it is. She gives a whole summary if you don't want to read it. It's a long book, but in that hour or so lecture, she basically says that if you go back to the Cold War, the CIA got this idea that one of the key battle fronts would be the culture war. So they decided that the best way to do this was to put a lot of money into certain magazines, certain student groups, and what they call the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was this sort of funded alliance of artists that would promote freedom. Of course, we're never really told what freedom is, or freedom from what, or freedom to do what. It's just sort of these really generic ideas of freedom. But generic ideas always seem to do very well in propaganda, because they're elastic and it allows the people hearing it to kind of mean what, they can paste onto whatever meaning they want. So this included, as you mentioned, everybody from people like Jackson Pollock, Andy Warhol, pop art, abstract art, anything kind of wild and out there that you could think of at that time. But it was also quite a few people. It's called the CIA and the Arts and Letters Program. So this included people like Bertrand Russell. This included people like Malcolm Muggeridge, who was British intelligence. This included people like, there's a whole list in her book of all these, a lot of characters that you wouldn't expect, a lot of literary people too, right? So a lot of people who were, writing spy fiction were involved in this, and people that you might not expect, like French deconstructionists. So the CIA was even interested in recruiting people in the tradition of Diderot and Foucault, people like that. Postmodernists were very important for this operation, because the idea was just simply that since the Soviets were focusing on realism and cosmism, the West needed anything that promoted freedom. And so that was part of the artistic cultural sphere, was the war of freedom against empire, tyranny, and all of that. So that was their reasoning for doing it. And I think that it's very important for understanding that relationship never really ended, even though there's no Congress for Cultural Freedom. The relationship between the intelligence agencies, Hollywood, and the productions that they would put out obviously always continued. And the deeper that you get into this, I think we find out that was always there. I mean, I know the CIA wasn't always there, but if you go back to the days of like Howard Hughes, he was working directly with the government and the military to put out propaganda, even the 1920s. So whether it's the predecessor of the CIA, the OSS, John Ford working directly with the OSS. The OSS actually helped him get his Academy Award because he had helped to film so much war propaganda. We also have the same thing with Hitchcock working for the British Minister of Information, filming propaganda, the Alexander Korda Circle, which I wrote about in my book. There was somebody put out a whole documentary I noticed on YouTube a couple of years ago, a very well done documentary. I think it's called Hollywood Spies, and it's okay. But actually, everything in that documentary was actually what I put in the first book. So they even talked about the Korda Circle, Alexander Korda, and how they recruited so many people to be a part of this. But anyway, yeah, I'm rambling, but you get the point here.
Well, it's interesting to me that when you kind of talked about a very philosophical concept of freedom to or freedom from, and you can kind of dissect that as to what that means, what freedom actually means. You're saying to most people, they don't really question what is the particular idea behind that concept. But it sounds like this sort of drive towards from high modernism to late modernism to postmodernism, it kind of had this feature of, what we all learned in humanities grad school, the destruction of the grand narratives, right? We all took those courses. But it sounds like these agencies and government officials are almost giving it like a push to kind of get to that point faster. How there's that feature is built into the ideology, but there's someone who is actually actively working toward this destruction of the grand narratives, like we said. So is that how you view this particular direction? Sort of philosophy, ideology, but also the involvement of government, actual specific government structures?
Yeah, it's called Weltanschauungskrieg, or worldview warfare. So this comes up in the actual, sort of psychological warfare writers and planners and strategists. They see it as very central to changing the minds of the opposition. So that's why we see, for example, today so much propaganda on the internet, is because it's just part of information war, it's part of psy war to target the opposition and to change their minds, demoralize them. I think that a big part of this with for example, the degeneracy that we see in a lot of the art, going back to postmodernists and even the emergence of the satanic in art, that is tied to this as well, because I think they understood that through art, you could also do a kind of aesthetic terrorism and brutalize a population, debase them with art. Even Plato sort of understood that unbridled artistic expression can actually lead to revolution in society. So in Plato's mind, there had to be, some pretty strict rules about art and music and poetry and all that. That was his reasoning. And you know, the people that study our society, the technocracy, the social engineers, they're aware of all of that. It's in their documents. And like I said, like, you know, this spirit, I think you can see it in the Frankfurt School. You can see it in, and it was actually the OSS that brought the Frankfurt School over to the U.S. at the request of Bertrand Russell to help fight the culture war against Tiny Mustache Man. And so the idea was that the only way to defeat at that time the sort of neoclassical style that the Tiny Mustache Man followers were promoting was through an earlier version of this culture war, which the Frankfurt School thought would be done through culture critique or tearing down through culture critique. And then I think that sort of evolves into the process of the CCF, Congress for Cultural Freedom, and the postmodernist stuff. So, but I think you're right that ultimately it's a kind of an attack on the mind, on the soul, even perhaps. I mean, even brutalist architecture, I think, has this same power, maybe to sort of reorient man's thinking. We can't restrict this, you know, to, not that you're doing this, but we can't restrict it to writing and to painting pictures. I mean, it's architecture as well. And I don't remember, maybe it was Spankler or somebody said something like, even architecture expresses the soul of a people. I think that's true. So I think that when you sort of enforce or promote or push a lot of these things for cultural engineering, it has that effect on the soul and on the psyche of the people as well. And it can be very damaging. And I think that they know that. So I think that, you know, if you look at entities like Tavistock, Tavistock has been very instrumental in pushing, for example, the biological agenda for the last few years. And I think they know from a technocrat perspective that it's very damaging, and they push it because it's damaging.
That's interesting, because to me, let's say in the Soviet Union, brutalism existed in kind of a broader artistic world where you actually also had beautiful expressions of art, not necessarily, you know, socialist realism, but other kinds of realistic depictions that were more in line with slight variations, but let's say, you know, a 2,000 year or more than 2,000 year tradition of, roughly speaking, Western art. Whereas in the West, again, using this loaded term, brutalism existed in a very different environment of all these things essentially falling apart. I wasn't going to ask this, but since you brought it up, this is also very interesting to me. You talk about the emergence and the proliferation of the satanic in art. Would you say that it's different from the previous depictions of the demonic, satanic, let's say, I don't know, the Middle Ages? I know it's a very long period, because the morality was much more clear at the time, whereas today everything is sort of muddy and anything goes, and like you're saying, it goes along with everything else that's been destroyed, and there's really no point of reference anymore. Is this how you perceive it? How do you differentiate between, let's say, you know, I don't know, Romanesque art that would feature very overt demonic creatures versus what we see, I don't know, in music videos today or in film? What is the key difference here?
I think the medieval world had a sense of the place of the demonic in the story, where the demonic is bad, and that nowadays the demonic is not presented necessarily as bad, but actually as something liberating, freeing, edgy, and all of that. I think I think I wrote this in the first book, but it's the German expressionists were some of the first to experiment with satanic in film. So we never really seen that until very early in the stage of the production of the camera and movies. They were really pioneering with stuff that was pretty edgy and pretty wild, because there were no codes yet for film, and this is even prior to the Hays Code in the U.S. Like you could pretty much do whatever you wanted, and the German expressionists were very influential in doing quite a bit of the satanic in film. I don't know if anybody saw that popular German series Babylon Berlin. I think it's season 2 of Babylon Berlin takes place when they're actually doing some of this intentionally satanic German expressionism. And I thought it was interesting that in that series, in that season, some of the actors are actually part of a satanic cult. So I think that was kind of really going on, at least in Germany at that time, up into the Weimar period. So that was going on. There's also the Fabians were also very interested in, even in the 1890s, the first generation of the Fabian socialists had figured out that the promotion of the satanic in art and things like bestiality and so forth, that these had a very social, it was a shock to the system, so to speak. And that allowed later Fabian socialists to figure out that you could actually do culture war. And this is way before, the 1960s counterculture, way before the Congress for Cultural Freedom. The Fabians had figured that out a long time ago with pushing some very degenerate art way ahead of everyone else. But I think that you're right to say that, well, what's the real difference? I think the real difference is that even in the Middle Ages, there was kind of a coherent shared myth or story or narrative that the demonic was bad and that, God existed and angels existed and we were supposed to side with them and not with the demonic. And I think post, 1960s counterculture, with the breakdown of the narratives and the stories and the myths that we all collectively believed in the West, for the most part, now you get this sort of like just meaningless, nihilistic, just kind of everything goes. And that's the significance of the satanic for today's generation, is that they see it as a sort of an image or a symbol of liberation. But it really is just kind of like meaningless, nihilistic degeneracy. It doesn't have any real focus point or any kind of, it's not situated with any kind of story with meaning, is what I'm trying to say.
I understand. I think you could almost make this argument about heavy metal from 20, 30 years ago, where bands that would use dark symbols and satanic symbols were still drawing heavily upon the Christian myth, and they're presenting themselves whether theatrically or actually believing in it in a we're bad kind of way. So even there, the morality was kind of was a little bit more clear than something like this year's Eurovision. I don't think I've ever seen Eurovision, but I've seen the clips. Where that type of imagery is very overt, and like you're saying, it's devoid of any underlying fundamental meaning. Yes, there's shock value, but it is ultimately very nihilistic. There's no message behind, maybe perhaps liberating, like you're saying, but it's basically just images that are kind of disconnected from the original source, right? And again, a very postmodern way. So.
Exactly.
And the way, like you're saying, that makes it difficult for an ordinary person who is not really interested in this question like you are, to really understand what's going on, to differentiate between what, the underlying meaning, the image itself, what's being bombarded at them. And so that just makes it very, like you're saying, it is a shock to the system, even though this kind of imagery has been around for a while in 20th century and now into the 21st century. So I mean, sometimes you think people are sort of going overboard with that, oh, this is satanic and that is satanic. But when you think about it from this perspective, I think it makes a lot more sense.
Well, yeah. And there are goofy evangelicals that kind of like do go overboard and think everything is satanic or something. I mean, that's kind of silly, but there is, I think, if you just look at the 1960s counterculture and the history of the Church of Satan and Michael Aquino and these different split off characters, they also have a pretty consistent connection to the power structure, the establishment, military intelligence as well. So I think that really, from the vantage point of the establishment, all of these things matter and are relevant. Even if they seem silly, if you're part of the power structure, you are interested in, well, how does the satanic philosophy affect people? How can we utilize this cult, this group? Take Crowley himself. Crowley himself was an asset of British intelligence, famously. So the intelligence agencies, I think, are very interested in those things for their purposes. The government is interested in those things for, social engineering, for study, for research. What kinds of ideologies proliferate? How do they proliferate? How are they better? Which ones are better for controlling people, I think, is very relevant too.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even for those who might not be tuned into this question like you are at such a deep level, I think if you go on the social media of modern day, Church of Satan and its offshoots, you'll see they're pretty much on board with every major culture war,
Exactly.
culture war feature that's coming from, the power structures, which is, they'll slap on their multicolored flags, et cetera, et cetera. So where, originally the idea of Satan was about rebellion, but here it's completely in line with the status quo. So then that automatically leads you to the question, what are you rebelling against? And so it's really kind of fascinating to see that. And you see that in other, again, thinking about pop culture, like the metal scene, where you used to have an element of rebellion, but now it's very much in line with everything that's coming from the powers that be. And it was very, very revealing. So Jay, you brought up the term conspiracy and conspiracy theory a number of times in our dialogue. What is your perception? I know there's that famous meme that it takes about 6 months to go from a conspiracy to fact, especially in the last since 2020. What is your perception? I'm sure you've heard yourself being called a conspiracy theorist. Obviously, conspiracies, using big air quotes, are not all created equal. How do you view this?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a learning process for most of us. I remember, in my first exposure to this culture, and in America, there is a kind of, I guess you could say, kind of a subculture of conspiracy that's existed for a long time, going back even to the 1960s, with the anti-war, anti-establishment movements of Vietnam, perhaps. And then out of that, you get the 1980s kind of PatCon, Patriot conspiracy, ham radio conspiracy world. And that produced a lot of kind of clowns and weirdos. And it was oftentimes attached to these sort of, prepper American, sovereign citizen type ideas. That kind of morphed into the later Ron Paul phases, I guess you could say. And then we get the emergence of figures like Alex Jones and, in the late 90s, early 2000s with a lot of his documentaries. So there's always been this kind of vibrant culture since the 1980s. John Birch Society, obviously, I can't forget that. That's a big one. And, my exposure to this was actually kind of Birch Society literature critiquing the United Nations. So I had no idea really what all this meant, but I remember reading a book in 1998 about this topic, and it sort of introduced me to the idea that there was, a communist motivation behind the United Nations, and that kind of got me into reading about the Freemasons and the history of their secret society and this and that. So I think it's just kind of like you start tumbling down this rabbit hole. And in my undergrad, I was very interested in history. So I did a lot of modern European history classes, two of which were really important. One was modern Europe, and then one was French Revolution. And I had a specialist in Europe who was our professor, who's really, really good. And he knew everything about the French Revolution. So we got this really meaty, in-depth, analysis of everything going on with the Jacobins and the Girondins and all the ins and outs of all of that. And that was kind of like another doorway into understanding the relationship between non-state actors and the state, because we come to find out that a lot of revolutions are funded. It's not just idiots on the ground with ponytails, that are the movers and shakers. Most of the time, revolutions have people behind them and money going into it, or else it's not successful. And actually, it was that professor that kind of opened my eyes to that, as well as my Marxism critical theory professor, who was very open about the monetary support for Karl Marx to get a lot of his work done, to support his work, to promote his work. And most people don't ask those questions. And he himself was a Frankfurt School trained Marxist. So, I was kind of getting it from people in the establishment, who, in the academic establishment, I should say, not the elite establishment, and they were kind of, again, opening these doors of connections that, you don't really get unless you just read a lot of books. And the more that I got interested in this domain, like I said earlier, of what we call conspiracy, the more you realize, I think, that domain is full of garbage. I mean, there's just so much disinformation in that domain. That does not mean that none of the conspiracies are real. It just means that it's flooded intentionally with disinformation. So, it's a funny, interesting, fascinating domain. I've said for a long time, it's spooks, kooks, and crooks is a lot of what's going on in the conspiracy world and the alternative media domain. So I think that it becomes kind of an exercise in sussing out the best approximations of what was going on in this or that event. So, for example, the Big 9 event, I won't go into too much detail, but that was a big one for me in terms of questioning things. I'd never heard of Operation Northwoods, and then you're going to read those declassified documents, and lo and behold, it's very similar to some of the things that we saw on the Big 9, other declassified war games that were going on, exercises that same day. And so big questions started getting raised for me. And then that kind of led me to think, well, what is Northwoods? Who's this Ella Lemnitzer guy? Why is he suggesting this operation to the Kennedys? Well, it turns out he's like this former NATO guy, head of NATO. And what's NATO? All right, so I got to go read about that. Well, that leads me to the Cold War. What's going on in the Cold War? Well, maybe what I was told wasn't actually correct, right? So we start to, I think, through this almost philosophical questioning process, we kind of deconstruct our own views. I'm talking about us in the conspiracy world interested in it. And we realized, okay, so there's a lot of disinformation. Classic example of this would be, something like UFOs, aliens. I think aliens are like the biggest bunch of nonsense. There could be some kind of being, but what I think is way more clear is the usefulness of this narrative for disinformation and black ops than anything suggesting that there's really beings visiting from another galaxy or whatever. So I think that, the more that you dig in, the more that you try to find solid information and research, even to the point of reading the white papers and the big globalist texts. I think what you get is you get a much closer approximation of what's actually going on than if you just stay in the domain of a lot of speculation and cranks and quacks, because that is everywhere. So looking back on my first exposure to conspiracy material in 1998, I would say that some of the general ideas were correct, but it was way more nuanced and way more exciting in many ways than what I thought it was back in 1998 than where I'm at now. And does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yes, it sounds like what you're describing is this kind of a dog's breakfast kind of a domain where on the one hand you have lots of well-intentioned people who are asking questions, but they may or may not be able to discern and actually structure and prioritize information that they're coming across. And then you also have information that is almost like you're saying deliberately used to delegitimize asking good questions, like like the flat earth people, for instance, saying, look, this is what so-called conspiracy theorists believe, therefore everyone in this domain is absolutely batshit crazy.
And if you read Cass Sunstein is a classic for this, because he wrote that famous paper, which you would think, it's a Harvard law paper, you would think it would be about like psyops. It's actually a philosophy paper. And he says that this is what got him the Obama czar job, because he wrote this paper about cognitive infiltration. And the paper was about how to interject into online, quote, conspiracy communities floods of disinformation. So basically the thesis is that we can engineer and steer these people's worldviews, the people that are asking questions about the Big 9 event or whatever. He says just by flooding it with a bunch of garbage. And he went from that to being one of Obama's czars, and then I think he went to the NSA or something like that. So yeah, the classic cognitive infiltration paper of Cass Sunstein is a perfect example of that.
And then we can publish lots of articles in the media to say, look how silly they are, because this is what exists in this domain. Therefore, everyone who has any question that is slightly outside the dominant narrative is automatically linked to
grouped together with a bunch of idiots.
Right. So how did you learn to differentiate? Was it just literally by reading? And
I think that this is I'm not a big fan of academia, but I will say that, some of the things that like when I was in grad school, I was working as a research assistant. So what that allowed me to do was spend a lot of time, I think I did that for maybe a year and a half, basically just sitting in the library every day, like you were talking about, researching. And so I was able to, have access to all the databases of whatever, because, the universities have that access. And I could just basically sit there and research whatever I wanted. And we also had another grad class that was actually pretty good. It was actually by the professor that I can't stand, but it was called Research Methodologies. And those were really good classes because they were great at giving you the tools for how to do good research. So I had another class with that expert on the French Revolution that he had made us do some historical research methodologies work as well. So all of that, I think, helped to kind of get good at sussing out, crap from good stuff. At the same time as doing all of that, I had also been following, all this alternative media and information since the early 2000s, right? So I first saw Alex Jones in 2003, Lord Voldemort 2003, where he was talking about Skull and Bones, and I saw this little 5-minute clip, and I was like, "What's Skull and Bones?" So I went and read Sutton's book on Skull and Bones, and got an introduction to from economic historian, I should say, not a conspiracy theorist. What I found was that basically, I'm rambling. The whole point is this: what a lot of people were positing in their conspiracy books and lectures could be validated in books from the establishment, is what I'm trying to say. And I found that to be the strongest method of sort of proving or demonstrating versus speculation. I don't think it's wrong to speculate. I think if you make it very clear when you're speculating, that's fine, because everybody does this. Anybody who's an investigator, he's going to have pieces of information that he's going to put together into a theory. So everyone does this, and there's nothing wrong with you could call it espionage theorizing if you or geopolitical theorizing if you don't want to use the word conspiracy theorizing, right? That's intentionally a weaponized term, but it's really just pointing out criminal conspiracies at a high level. Do we think that people who have a lot of money and power don't conspire to do evil things? Well, of course they do. It's on the books. It's racketeering. It's criminal conspiracy. Those are real crimes. So obviously this is a real thing. Every investigator tries to build some explanation for what they think went down in that event. And so I think from analyzing, a lot of this stuff and combining it with kind of an academic approach over the years, you just get better and better, and it almost becomes kind of intuitive at a certain point where you can just sort of be like, okay, well, this is obviously a bunch of bull crap. This one, okay, this kind of looks pretty legit. You know what I mean? I think that's the process that you attune your skills, kind of like this is a cheesy analogy, but like, I don't know, like Poirot or like, like Murder She Wrote, where like grandma's seen so many crimes.
I grew up on Poirot, so that's, to me, it's a good analogy.
Yeah, like it's like you're doing that.
I read as a kid, yeah.
Yeah, I'm like Murder She Wrote, right? I'm like a grandma out here solving murder. like geopolitical murders.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I had a question exactly about that, because when I didn't know. I'm sorry, I didn't know your channel for too long. So Nina told me about the channel, and I went up to start knowing you. And the first thing that I noticed, and I actually mentioned this, is the first thing that you said, that your work is completely not structured whatsoever, and as is mine. And I'm not comparing myself. Okay, it's not the point of that. And at some point, I actually think that it's hard to struct everything, because it's just an endless star. But when I was listening to some of your videos, when you're talking, for example, about the financing of the Bolsheviks, the financing of the Communist Party, and to be honest, that's something that I'm trying to discuss sometime with someone, because I think it became a part of my vision when I started looking at the Paraguayan war between Brazil and Paraguay. Well, Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. And you understand how things get done by these powers at the moment, not exactly to get an objective, but just to create the chaos on the region at some point, to conquer, divide and conquer. That's the rule number one. And But my great question here, looking at all that, I start thinking about looking at your channel. I start thinking about the Matrix, the movie. I'm not going to talk about the movie, but just the perception that you have a big chunk of society that's completely asleep. You have a small chunk of society that is awakened, and yet is also part of the system, of the control system. You got the point. So I think you just answer how you get this hunch on things that you just at some point you do it by nose. You just, okay, this smell bad, this smell better, this is okay. But how can we know? How do you think we could try to know that at some level, people like us here are also not being used by the system as the people on the ground that say something that we believe we are fighting against the system, but we are just becoming part of a necessary fight against the system.
Yeah, in other words, like, how are we not being duped by controlled opposition or something? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, sorry by the long question. That was basically it.
No, I mean, that's that's, I guess, there's no easy answers to some of these questions. I mean, I think that, again, like, over time, if you see enough of this stuff, if you're decent at, recall and critical thinking, you kind of notice patterns, and you're going to notice things that you're not going to be able to forget. So, for example, in the last 4 years, we saw a push for some very heavy-handed things that I think people prior to the last 4 years wouldn't have even thought conceivable, and yet the establishment really tried to do it. So I think, even people with short memory spans, Brzezinski said something like the public only has like a 2-week memory span. So I think that the last 4 years were so crazy that it would be pretty difficult for them to try to push another type of thing like that. But at least they seem to be testing the waters with this new thing. So I think kind of at a certain point, the agenda, the establishment really uncloaks, and it's very difficult to not just say, okay, they're the bad guys. You know what I mean? So I don't think we even have to worry that much about, am I also being duped at another level of 6-dimensional chess of, this kind of stuff. And I think over time too, like, certain people, like, I always get asked about, what do you think about Trump? What do you think of Elon Musk? And like, I get really annoyed with that question, because I don't have any insight into people's inner states, their motives, or really all we can go by is their actions. And, I think we can be suspicious and sort of like withhold our decision, I guess, or say, I don't know. I mean, but I think it's very clear that at this stage, like, we know who the bad guys are. It's like they're out there openly saying, let's get rid of all the people. Let's have a total technocratic order. Let's, let international bodies run everything. Let's have a CBDC. Let's have every total tracking and tracing. It's like they literally just say all this stuff. So I don't even think we have to worry, is this guy over here that appears to be on our side actually on our side? Or, what I mean? It's like, it's kind of out now. Everything's in the open, which is weird, because even in 2019, it wasn't that out in the open. I mean, if you read a lot of these books, like dorks like me do, you would know it. But like, most people they couldn't conceive of what all they pushed for, even though it's in Klaus's book. Like, Klaus literally says everything in his book. And this was in 2018. He was like, we got to do this. We got to push this. And you look at the back of the book, like, who his helpers are. He's got a convenient list of all of his helpers. And it's like all of these academics. So it's like they just recruit, like Nina said, like all these academic dorks to be a part of this agenda, who think that they're, I'm working for the NGO. I'm really special. They recruited me out of the university. I'm so smart. And they're just working for people who are just complete psychopaths, right? So like, it doesn't, Like they're obviously the bad guys. Like we don't even have to worry about it anymore. Like that's who they're the bad guys. It's open. It's clear.
Yeah, no, this is completely clear for me. This might because this game that I'm playing for a very small amount of time, and you guys are just way ahead of me. These guys are also playing this game of social media and all that for a long time. And it was something that, well, perhaps in the US is less visible, but when you're Brazilian, you see the chaos that Facebook did in Brazil, the same one that they did in the Arab Springs and in Ukraine with the Maidan, all that. So for us, this social media thing was something that we start paying attention way back in 2014, perhaps. Okay, and it was.
So
exactly.
Are you saying that they like sparked a social revolution with social media in Brazil?
Oh yeah.
Okay, I wasn't aware, but makes sense.
I mean, it's trendy. You just start, as you say, you start to perceive things with your nose. At that time, I was at Facebook, down with Dilma Rousseff and all that. And then years later, Arab Spring, and then, Syria and Ukraine and Georgia, and name your country here. Everything social media, and then you see China has blocked social media, like, well, not all of it, but Facebook, mainly Facebook and Twitter before being bought by Mr. Musk. Russia, same thing. And you see the countries that have survived, I would say, from these social media attacks. I mean, you open Netflix, watch the Ukraine Maidan documentary, first sentence. The protests start to be organized by Facebook.
Yes.
You watch Arab Spring.
Yeah.
I remember at the time. I remember because it was, as you said, things that you remember watching the TV, and they were, okay, this is Arab Spring, this thing in Egypt, people just organized by Facebook. And then you see Sri Lanka, and then Sri Lanka, people organized by Facebook. And then you see that the guys on the NGOs are trained to use social media and all that. So at some point, you just look back. And as I said, I'm just starting playing this game because I start paying attention to geopolitics and all this in 2022 when, Russia invaded Ukraine, full invasion of Ukraine, whatever they want to call it. But then I started to pay attention to all the things that, as you perfectly said, and it's something that I always say in the channel, you have to learn to unlearn before you want to go forward. So you have to throw away a lot of things that you thought it was true.
Yeah, exactly.
And when you come to this point, and this is the point, you get to the rabbit hole, because once you decide, okay, this is not true, this is clearly not true, but I learned otherwise, so I have to unlearn this. So everything else that I have learned in my life, what is true and not? And then you start looking back, and as I say, I had to start to look back to Paraguayan War in Brazil to have this perception that it was England operation there to unstable the reign of Brazil, the empire of Brazil. Back at the time we were a monarchy, and then you start looking at everything, and there's always someone that puts his finger somewhere. Something happened in it, and that's why I mentioned the thing that you said about the Bolshevik Revolution and the French Revolution as well. I believe there's always someone behind it, and as I said, this game is they are playing this game longer, and they own it. How can we be sure we are not the necessary inconvenient? But I understand perfectly, and your answer for me is perfect. That
to me, Marcelo, I think we also have to recognize from kind of a more philosophical perspective that we do exist within the total ideology, and we can be cognizant enough the way Jay described, but at some point we can't completely unplug ourselves. In some ways, we are responding and reacting rather than generating something completely new. So, there also is that recognition that we can't completely escape our time, that we are products of our time to a certain extent, or that we arrived at these conclusions because we're products of our time and we engage in critical thinking. So I don't necessarily think that it's you have to just completely surpass where we live and be, in the year 3025 by using some kind of, philosophical analysis. So I think being cognizant to me is sufficient. That's all really we can do. That's what's within our power. But now that we touched upon the question of geopolitics, Jay, you probably know that's one of my favorite topics. How do you view the sort of tectonic changes that have been happening in the past couple of years in relation to your interest, as you're saying, the world of conspiracy, some of these extra, how would you call it, supranational organizations? What is the relationship between all of this in your view?
I think it's become a lot more evident that, stuff that you talked about, maybe even back in 2014, 2015, the stuff that Mark Hackard talked about 2014, 2015. In fact, I was just looking at some of the old essays on Espionage History Archive the other day and looking back at some of the analyses of the Ukraine situation. I think what's happened is that a lot of what was being said at that time and kind of our speculations and theorizing, that's really been borne out. I think we've seen that the establishment made various moves and pivots to further put pressure on Russia, precisely because of what Brzezinski talks about in terms of controlling the Eurasian sphere. That's a key element of dominance for the West. To maintain dominance is to try to control that arena. And we've only, I think, seen that borne out by the actions. I think a lot of people were speculating that a war would occur because of the provocations that were going on for a long time in that region on the part of the West. I think, again, like everything I think about in terms of like the things that we were saying on podcasts in 2014, 2015, like all of that has like been totally vindicated. It's pretty crazy. I found another one with Brandon Turbeville the other day in an interview that I'd done in 2013 or 14, and he did a whole hour talking about Ukraine as a key area of Western control, and that it could actually lead to a regional war. So again, it was all kind of there, and even in Brzezinski's last book, Strategic Vision, there was a whole section on targeting Ukraine and why that was so important. So it was kind of like a powder keg, I guess, waiting to pop off. And then we saw, things pop off in the Middle East soon after with Israel. So, yeah, I don't know what to say about, like, other than that, it's really just vindicated everything that we kind of theorized and talked about. And, the things that we were analyzing and saying what the West wanted, what they were doing with certain pipelines, how they wanted to control the resources coming into Europe and what these different regions that also related, of course, to Syria and Turkey and the attempt to overthrow Assad from back in the day. All of these things are connected because they really just kind of relate to the geographical pivot of the Western approach trying to control these regions. So, here we are now that it's popping off, and it could get really bad. We've got Europe talking about draft. You've got people talking about sending American soldiers. I mean, it's almost like, I don't know, were we predicting the future? Not really, but you know what I mean?
Well, you're sort of following these patterns, and you arrived at a conclusion that ended up actually matching what's been happening. Yeah, Brzezinski talked about Russia without Ukraine being at best a regional power, and with Ukraine being a global power. And of course, in classic geopolitics, Russia has, the heartland. The person who controls the heartland controls the world. So it kind of goes back to all that. But even on a broader scale, we throw the term multipolarity a lot. There is this unofficial alliance or a strategic relationship between Russia and China. Things seem to be moving eastward towards Asia. it seems like the West, or the powers, the elites that control the West, are trying to hold on to power, perhaps doubling down in places where they do have power, like Europe, and in my view, a way to bring Europe down, as is the case with Germany, and Germany losing access to cheap Russian natural resources and essentially going through deindustrialization, which is shocking. I don't think anyone could have imagined this just a few years ago. Germany,
Right.
this superior power of the European continent. So from that perspective, I know we can't really look into the future and make predictions, and it's difficult to make predictions in such a dynamic situation with so many moving parts. But do you think the elites, people who control the current global order, I guess we can call them, do you think they will be successful or unsuccessful? Or is it just basically a battle of two different elite groups at this stage?
It's funny. I was just reading, I picked up this old book from Jacques Attali from 1991. And it's his book, which is ironic because half of the book is really prescient and accurate as to what he predicted. He predicted a lot of other people coming into America and into Europe, thus changing the demographics by design. But he also has a weird prediction where it says that Europe would be the future powerhouse to replace America. That didn't happen. And that's exactly speaking to what you said, that, even Jacques Attali back at the time was thinking that he was going to be heading up the future big bank of the world. In fact, the opening chapter is Alvin Toffler writing an introduction and saying that Attali has been placed at the head of the some big European bank, which would be in charge of, because this is right after the wall had fallen, making sure that all of the Eastern European bloc Soviet countries would be integrated into the economics of the EU. This is right at the public announcement of the EU. The EU had been planned back at the time of the 40s and 50s by Bilderberg and the OSS, but he had in mind that he was going to be, like running the New World Order at the biggest bank in Europe. And that didn't happen, which is wild. I mean, he's still a powerful global elite controller. He's the Kissinger of France, but sometimes these things don't go the way they expect. And I definitely hope that the, austerity ghoul attitude of the Western elite doesn't go the way they plan. I think people are figuring out that all of these strategies, all the things that they push, don't benefit the people in general. It really only benefits a tiny, tiny elite group. And you can't really run a society as technologically advanced and interrelated and complex as ours when you try to have no cars and no dairy and no meat. I mean, it's not going to function. So it's kind of like people wonder, okay, are we at this stage where the Western elite are just out of their minds and they're so deluded that they think that you can enforce a system totally divorced from reality? Maybe. Or is it like an intentional destruction of Western civilization and society on purpose? It's hard to know exactly the motivations. I tend to favor, even though I think in my 20s, I was way overly conspiratorial. I'm a lot less conspiratorial than I used to be in my 20s, because you find out things are a little more complex than like one big conspiracy. There's a lot of players, there's a lot of power blocks, there's a lot of machinations. I mean, it's really hard to figure out, I guess, at times, whether we're dealing with people who really believe they're crap, or they're so cunning that they want everything that will destroy the existing structure. So I don't know. It's a really good question. I mean, does Klaus really think that he's going to have Skynet running everything? I mean, he
might be so disconnected from the situation on the ground that, and also, we talked about narcissists and psychopaths. There might be a little bit of that disconnection from, regular humans happening, that there's no self-reflection about the way such statements in books, like you mentioned, would be interpreted by an ordinary person. But yeah, it's interesting to think about predictions. You quoted this book. I would think about to me, the obvious example is Karl Marx, because he was very prescient about the relationship between different social groups under capitalism, and it's still very much relevant. But of course, his prediction about the dissolution of the state into a stateless society is completely inaccurate. So you can kind of look at different thinkers and say, we can take this from this individual, and we have to throw this part out because it just didn't come to fruition. Obviously, being discerning.
Take the example of the idea, and I just saw one of the other global goons talking about how they want to shoot for no vehicles in the next few years. Like, I mean, how do they think anything would function without vehicles? I mean, this is just so preposterous to me. Like, first of all, you've got like a really intricate supply chain logistics that delivers all products based on trucks. Okay. We're not at Back to the Future flying, skateboards and cars yet. So like if you try to move into I mean, I don't believe in fossil fuels. I don't know what oil is, but I don't think it's fossils. But whatever oil is, like, we're not ready for a post-oil world yet. Maybe in the future that can happen, but the idea that you could like just institute this is just crazy.
We also have a deliberate rejections of nuclear power, let's say in Germany, where they could have been using it, but they're not. And now they've gone back to using actually really dirty energy like coal and some other sources that are almost, back in the 19th century. So I think that goes back to your question of, are they really not having any self-reflection, or is it deliberate? Yeah, for sure.
It seems like a cult too. Like they have this sort of like eco-cult mindset that very similar to what you're saying with the Bolsheviks or the Marxists. Like it's almost like they believe that you can just instantiate any idea if you have the strongest willpower to do so.
And
like
also
you can
do
just
it really
make it
quickly, really rapidly. Like in the Soviet Union, that attempt was made in the 1920s, and then Stalin had to basically scrap a lot of that because it was just not applicable to the very socially conservative society of Russia and the former Soviet Union of the time. So yes, the fact that it wasn't done gradually as well, I think was a really important factor. So. But let's shift gears a little bit. You said that you've been working on looking at religion and connections to intelligence agencies trying to influence religion. I looked at some of your recent episodes where you made a comparison between the deliberate attempts to undermine the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. You compared it to the Bolshevik, the Bolshevik successful drive to basically diminish the power of the Orthodox Church in the early Soviet Union. Where are you at in this domain? What have you found out? I know that specifically to the, I've been obviously following the Ukraine situation really closely. I've looked up, for instance, the role of the Patriarch of Constantinople endorsing this breakaway schismic church in Ukraine, and it deliberately uses a very similar name. It's the Orthodox Church of Ukraine instead of Ukrainian Orthodox Church, to make it very confusing for people reading news articles unless they really know what's going on. That seems deliberate. So what have you found out about this?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of, it's kind of absurd. I mean, even the Patriarch of Constantinople formerly did not recognize this group. But when essentially told by Washington or the State Department that he better, he did. So he changed his position. The character that they originally, Domenko, that they originally recognized as this sort of shady, sus character, very well known for being shady and sus. So, it's all kind of absurd on the face of it when you don't even have to go that far into it. We had former members of the CIA flying over there to help meet with these people to help set up this parallel ecclesiastical structure. And really, this is just to further foster the cultural division beyond the actual war. So prior to the war, I think there was a lot of this going on to prepare for that division that they would later do in a more kinetic way, I guess you could say. So this is part of a larger, long-standing program that is, I mean, it's not unique to, the CIA or the OSS. You can go back to the declassified documents, for example, where Patriarch Athenagoras and his predecessor was already on board with whatever the OSS and CIA wanted. They're actually sending cables saying to Bill Donovan and others, yeah, we'll do whatever you say. So under the guise of fighting the Cold War, it wasn't just the Patriarch of Constantinople, but actually the same events occurred with the Vatican as well. And it's called the Doctrinal Warfare Program, which was this attempt, which was pretty successful, to make sure that the Second Vatican Council, via certain figures who had been made some degree of asset with the CIA, particularly Jesuits like John Courtney Murray, to ensure that the documents were written and worded in a certain way that would be amenable to the ecumenist project, because ecumenism is really, if you go back to its origins, it's an American project. It has its origins in the Chicago World Fair and the Rockefellers. The Rockefellers took this on as their pet project. This is in their authorized biography. So they essentially funded the entire movement. And the idea was that Christianity could just be harnessed and turned into a form of American soft power. That's it. It's that simple. The actual projects, and it's called the Doctrinal Warfare Program by C.D. Jackson. He's a very famous CIA psychological warfare expert. He was involved in other things in Hollywood as well, but his particular brainchild was the Doctrinal Warfare Program. And this really was highlighted at the best by David Wimhoff, his excellent book about John Courtney Murray and Henry Luce in Time Magazine. It's a masterful work. It's 800 pages. He's a Roman Catholic himself. I can't recommend it enough because it's really a key window into in what way the power structure in verifiable documented fact co-opted the Vatican. And they did it in a very open way. So it wasn't some sort of super secret project. I mean, maybe at the time the Doctrinal Warfare Program in the 1950s and 60s was private, but it's been declassified. It's well known now. And they just basically took certain Jesuits who believed that Americanism was a way forward for the Roman Catholic Church to, with the spirit of Vatican II, open the doors to a new Pentecost, aggiornamento of the terminology of John the 23rd, et cetera, et cetera. And subsequent research that I did in terms of CIA writers and historians who were actually critical of who took a more pro-CIA bent, like Kaler's books, John Kaler, and then the other texts that are more critical of the CIA in the Cold War, like Paul Williams's Gladio book. What we start to realize is that both of those books, both pro and both anti, are essentially admitting, yeah, of course the CIA had this super intimate relationship with Paul VI, John Paul II, and subsequent popes, and they formed this alliance, particularly out of what they felt was a need to win the Cold War. And they were very successful in duping a lot of the prelates. I mean, I'm not a fan of the Roman Catholic Church, but I'm saying that they were also, I think, genuinely duped into making this alliance out of the necessities of winning the Cold War. And so what happens is that when you've got, John Paul II meeting consistently with Colby, when you've got Paul VI meeting on a regular basis with Kissinger to make these decisions, I mean, you've essentially wedded yourself to that power structure in the exact same way that the patriarchs of Constantinople had done in the Cold War too. And that's the background to where we are now, to where we see Francis essentially supporting everything that Klaus and the World Economic Forum says. We now have this document that just dropped today where Francis is basically saying, let's do whatever we can to bring the Orthodox back into the fold of Rome. And the problem with that is, a lot of people might think, well, but why don't we want to all be united? We don't want to be divided. And the problem is that ecumenism is a geopolitical project. And it's a project making the church essentially a tool of the Western power elite. So it's not even about what it's presented as. It's absolutely 100% a geopolitical project, and that's the problem with it, is that it's making the church subservient to the Atlantis power block and what they want.
Okay, and so then specific to Ukraine, is this, obviously it's a piece of the puzzle, but is it also about basically just causing chaos and division by creating this new institution? And we can go back to the 90s, to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when the more sort of traditional church, and specifically in Western Ukraine, the Greek Catholics would forcibly claim churches that belong to the Orthodox Church. And there are, hundreds, if not thousands, of documented cases of this since way, way, way before the Orange Revolution, before the Maidan, and before the 2022 escalation. So this has been going on for a while. And I know that today it seems like the Greek Catholics are sort of very friendly toward the schismatic church as well. So there seems to be some kind of a very interesting rapprochement going on between those two. And so in this geopolitical context, it seems to make more sense if you think about it the way that you are describing, where it's basically just an instrument. It's not about any kind of, we're going to break away from Russian dominance, we're the true religion, yada, 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 any of these slogans. It seems to be primarily an instrumental situation with using the church in this way.
Yeah, it's not about theology. And a lot of the institutions that you would suspect are involved and have been involved in the Ukraine. For example, Fordham University, the famous Jesuit university, which has this very important Eastern Orthodox study program. That's all an attempt to retool and engineer and steer this stuff. And in fact, Fordham was very instrumental, Jesuits very instrumental in fomenting this Ukraine situation. But that's not all. In fact, the CIA has also used charismatic non-denominational churches as well to push anything anti-Russia, anything anti-Orthodox Church in Ukraine, canonical Orthodox Church in Ukraine. So they've actually used all of these outlets, very, very public. It's not even, they've even used cults. Mark had a great example of one of those Clinton-connected charismatic cults that was being used in the Ukraine to foster anti-Russian sentiment there as well. So that's how. Well,
there was an explosion of cults in the former Soviet Union in the 90s. So some of them were religious cults, some of them were just dog's breakfast of different, pulling from different ideologies, much like you have today in North America as well. So that sort of died down. It still exists, but certainly all these denominations that are very small coming and doing missionary work from North America was also quite prevalent in the 90s and the early 2000s. And I think it's died down, but not really completely. I know, again, we don't want to make predictions. So far from what I've seen, the people underground, it's making their religion, it's making at least underground the canonical Orthodox Church stronger. Where do you see this going?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's people in the Orthodox world who have kept up with this a lot better than me in terms of like literally following on a day-to-day basis since it's happened. Father John Whiteford has tracked this very, very closely. He would know a lot better about those kinds of underground situations. But I would suspect that that's the case. I think that we've seen so many heavy-handed moves on the part of Zelensky's government to try to shut down. That just doesn't play very well when people see that. Tucker Carlson recently called attention to that. Lord Voldemort did too. So, a lot of people are kind of noticing and seeing like, why is this happening? Like, why would you have to do this? And again, remember, Bartholomew himself previously recognized the canonical Orthodox Church there. So, I mean, why would he just suddenly change his mind? I mean, it only makes sense when we understand, as my buddy Jim Jatras has pointed out, there's pretty good evidence that heavy-handed, influence was put upon a lot of hierarchs. And by the way, that will continue where the West will continue to put pressure on the other patriarchates. I think Alexandria a couple of years ago flipped from being a pro-canonical church to whatever Washington says. And it's, I think, just becoming apparent that, all of these things are connected. So the push, the reason that Francis has put out this document today is because, as Bartholomew has pointed out, and I think they raid the Orthodox Journalists of Ukraine website that then get raided recently by the SBU, I think.
There's been so many. There's been physical attacks.
They had written articles. Yeah. They had written some really key articles about Bartholomew and Francis in 2025 want to push for reunion, and they want to do it on the anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. So that would be 2025. So 1700 year anniversary would be a great push for this ecumenist move. And again, remember that in Ukraine, ecumenism was a key tool of the Western geopolitical elite against the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And they were using a lot of these ecumenist institutes, universities, again, to foment the anti-Russian approach, as well as these charismatics were also ecumenists. The reason I'm saying all that is that the bigger goal here is to push for the union of East and West, and Bartholomew is a tool to really push that. He's even called for this union. So they're going to test the waters and see how far they can get with these ideas. They float these ideas, and if they think enough people support it, then they'll push for it. And that means that in America, you've got a lot of Orthodox, like GOARC, Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, that will probably go along with what Bartholomew wants to do here. So the intention is to split the Orthodox Church right down the middle. That's, I think, a geopolitical strategy. If they can get the rest of them under Francis and Bartholomew are already essentially under the control of the West. I mean, the logic there is it makes perfect sense why they're doing this. That's why they're doing it. I wish I could speak more to the suppression and the underground church. I just don't know enough about it.
Sure, no worries. But why don't we sort of go back a little bit? How did you discover Orthodoxy? And I'm someone who was born into Orthodoxy, who's descended from priests, but you're much, much, much more knowledgeable about the history of the church and theology. What was your journey? I hate to use the word journey, sound like a hippie, but how did you get into Orthodoxy? And how do you view the situation in Orthodox America today because of these geopolitical developments?
Yeah, I did a lot of DMT, man. I had a journey. I had a vision quest ceremony. I was raised Baptist and was very interested in church history and theology by age 18, 19, right around the same time that I was first exposed to like John Birch Society literature. So, I was getting more interested in that stuff, and, how do we know which religion's right? What's the right church? What's happening in history? So I got really interested in apologetics and philosophy and all those topics as I started undergrad. And I was kind of, at that time, it was like 2003. There wasn't a whole lot of stuff online. And mostly what you would encounter is Protestant versus Catholic debates. So in 2003, that's all I knew. I was like, well, that's all there is. I didn't even know about Orthodox. I mean, I heard of that Orthodox Church, but I didn't really know anything about it. And by about 2007, after I'd become Catholic, I started having concerns because 2001 was when I really started looking at the East-West debate. And then by about 2007, after I'd become Catholic, I started noticing, there's a lot of issues and difficulties with a lot of these papal claims and documents. And even today's document that they just dropped is essentially a lot of concessions to the Orthodox critique of the claims of the papacy, especially at Vatican I. So, basically I was just exposed to a third possibility that maybe it's not Protestant or Catholic, maybe there's another option that's out there. But there were still very few resources online at that time in 2007. There was a few blogs that dealt with Orthodox stuff, and I met some people on Facebook that were Orthodox, and so I got exposed to it. I started reading the church fathers from the East. I had read a lot of Latin church fathers and just sort of took it for granted that, that's the church. That's the papal view, right? If you're Roman Catholic, you kind of just focus on the Latin church fathers and Augustine and Jerome and Amber. You're not really worried with all these Eastern people. So I just started reading a lot of them in depth. I read Athanasius at length, and I read the Cappadocians at length, and I read Cyril, and I read Maximus and John Damascus at length. And I got a much more of an interest in that domain, but I was still not sure. I was dating a girl and was going to get engaged at that time, and we were catechumens in the Orthodox Church in 2007, but we ended up deciding not to get married, which was the right decision. And so I held off on becoming Orthodox at that time, and just kind of I was just in a kind of a state of limbo for a long time. Had a phase where I was reading a lot of perennialist stuff, reading a lot of Neoplatonic stuff. Still wasn't sure where to go. I even read Kabbalistic stuff. I didn't commit to these positions, but I was interested in all these positions. And so I wanted to expose myself to all the options. And then about 2014, I sort of started getting back into reading Eastern Church Fathers, particularly St. Maximus, the Confessor. I read a lot of his philosophical texts, and was warming up again to the idea of Orthodoxy. Started attending Antiochian Orthodox liturgy here and there. Eventually decided to become catechumen and officially join. That was 2017/2018. So that's the long sort of, for me, it was just a lot of like church father pathways and figuring out like, well, whose model of the Trinity was more correct, what east-west. Essence-centered distinction was a huge thing, which is, a unique Orthodox doctrine, pretty much non-existent in the Latin Church. I think you could argue it's excluded. So a lot of those things that I felt like were pretty clear doctrines, the more I studied the theology, the more it was like, well, maybe the Roman Catholic papal system is itself just a big mess because it has departed from a lot of the fundamentals of the first 1,000 years of Christianity. And I think, since 2014 to the last 10 years, for me, that's just really become obvious. It's more and more been vindicated in my mind.
Okay, so it sounds like it's essentially not just a spiritual, but a heavily intellectual journey for you too.
It was both. Yeah, I mean, it was both things going on. Yeah.
And so how do you view the status of Orthodoxy in North America today? Do you view it as divided along these sort of geopolitical divisions that exist and are really have been amplified very recently?
I would say at the clerical level, more so than on the ground. I think on the ground, the general Orthodox population has a sense of the faith and has a lot of the things correct. I think a lot of the subverted clergy are probably the main problem, more so than the laity. And that's particularly within certain sectors and jurisdictions. And it's not total, but it's just certain figures. Obviously, certain key figures within GoArt are fully radical and in line with Bartholomew and even more radical, liberation theology type positions. So, that's probably the key main problem in the Orthodox world. I think that a lot of the more Slavic jurisdictions are pretty solid, so to speak. Russian Orthodox Church in America is pretty solid. The Serbs are pretty solid. Probably the Romanians and the Antiochians next. And that's not to say that there's not, solid people in the Greek jurisdictions, but they tend to be the most kind of Americanized of the clerics. So I think that's where we see more of the problems, but that's not to say that there's not problem people in every jurisdiction in terms of clergy. But that's my analysis of it. But I think that Russian Orthodox Church has done a pretty good job in the U.S. of standing fast in their traditions. So that's where I attend.
It does to me, again, I'm sort of a little bit more removed from this world. It sounds jurisdictional to a certain extent. So some people perceive you as almost this unofficial promoter of Orthodoxy because you have such a big social media presence, et cetera. So, I can go to my local church here and someone would say, I first got interested in Orthodoxy because I listened to a podcast by Dyer, and I'm not exaggerating. I have heard this from people in different places in random conversations. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it wasn't anything I expected to occur. I mean, I think me from back even in the days of like 2008, 9, 10 on Facebook.
I don't remember how we got on each other's Facebook. I remember thinking like, this is a very annoying Catholic guy. So
yeah, I was just a random nerd arguing.
I definitely did not expect this
I didn't either. Yeah. So, the life goes in crazy directions. I mean, I just remember, Yeah, I didn't. So the way this kind of happened was, like I said, you go back to like 2014, 15, 16. I was mainly just blogging about movies and film analysis. I was getting more interested in kind of going back in the direction of orthodoxy at that time, but I was still focused on, film and that kind of stuff. And I think kind of just randomly one day, somebody said, "Hey, do you want to go on with Andy Worski and do a debate with JF?" And that was kind of it got a lot of attention, a lot of traction. I had done one other debate with that libertarian Adam Kokesh right before that. So it was just kind of on a whim to do debates. It wasn't something I was really planning to, I'm going to be, we're going to start doing debates. And then we did a few more kind of crazy blood sport debates with Worski back in 2016. Fick Nuentes and I did a debate on Worski's thing, and that got a lot of traction at the time. So it kind of started a snowball of like doing these things, and separate from all the debating I was reading, again, a lot of Orthodox theology throughout those years. And so I just kind of like more and more was talking about it, but I didn't have any plan to be a Orthodox media outlet. Certain controversial things happened where big Orthodox outlets started coming after me unprovoked, and that kind of got me to respond to them. And it just sort of grew and grew and grew, and then it turned into debating atheists, and it turned into debating basically all the top Muslims. Then it turned into debating, all these other people, Roman Catholic scholars and theologians and apologists. So it just snowballed, and it turned into this. And then I think certain other events occurred that kind of made the audience grow quite a bit. 4 years now of hosting, Fourth Hour Lord Voldemort was a huge bump to the attention of the audience. Getting in the Tucker special was a huge bump. So those things indirectly kind of, blew up the audience to then get people thinking, oh, well, he does a lot of these debates and but it was never an intentional, like, oh, I want to be an Orthodox. I mean, I consider myself to be much more of a ridiculous person than any sort of like religious figure. So, a lot of what I do.
You have a little bit more responsibility, even though this happened accidentally and organically.
Unfortunately, yeah. Unfortunately, yeah.
Interesting. Well, I think the Tucker special is a good segue into asking kind of a little less serious question. How did you get into comedy, and how does comedy play into what you do? So, for those who haven't seen it, it's on your channel. You are doing an amazing impression of our friend Mr. Schwab and trying to get random people to eat the bugz. Obviously, you've done a lot of other impressions. My favorite one is the Pope of the Future. I even purchased the hat.
You did? That's amazing.
I bought the hat. It's been used, the French fry hat. So it's one of my favorite impressions. So how does comedy, it's a little bit less of a serious question, but obviously it's something that you've done over the years for a while. How does it play into what you do? What is the purpose behind the comedy?
Yeah, that was just something I've always, originally when I was in high school, I just wanted to be a comedian. But I found, things that I felt were a little more important than just being a clown. But I've never lost that aspect of, my personality of being a clown. So I think when I was doing a lot of stuff in 2014, 15, just beginning to do podcasts, everybody kind of had the phase of like you blog for a while, and then it became podcasts, and then it became videos. So we all kind of went through these phases. And, when I was podcasting, I was a lot more reserved, and probably I just wasn't confident enough in a lot of that side of my personality to kind of let it out. I think after you do, 10 years of podcasting and videos, you get a lot more comfortable with talking and being yourself. It's just a thing you have to kind of train yourself to do. So we've integrated more and more of that over the years, just because I find it very boring if all of my time is just me talking about serious documents. I just can't, I can't do it. And I also can't just talk about one subject endlessly. Like I get tired of it. So I kind of go through these cycles where I'll talk about movies for, a few weeks and focus on that. And then I get bored with that. And then I move on to talking about theology for a few weeks. And then I don't want to talk about that. And I go back to talking about geopolitics for a few weeks. So I've had for me, that's kind of been a workable situation where I can just kind of cycle through stuff. But I see comedy as very important, and maybe more and more important as time goes by, because that is a key way to satirize and make fun of these people is a really powerful weapon. It's maybe even more effective at times, if you can do it right, than, you know, writing some boring article refuting, because way more people are going to watch you impersonating Klaus than some article you wrote about it. It's just a lot more effective if you can do it right. And yeah, my approach has typically been, you know, I do a lot of impressions. I think we're up to about 30 or 40 impressions that are decent. It's a lot more wacky, abstract, goofy, silly style than it is like the traditional stand-up routine. When I do the live events now, last year we started integrating live events, and I do have a whole comedy like presentation that I do, and I've experimented with different stuff. It's a little weird because characters and skits are very different than stand-up. I'm not a huge fan of stand-up. I really prefer the sketch model. But that kind of is difficult if it's just you. Like, it's easy if I'm just the Pope, right? But Pope of the future. But yeah, I mean, maybe I can figure out a way to integrate it into stand-up. But like, what I'll tell you what. So what we did last year, and it's different this year. What I'm doing this year is different. But last year, what I did was the live show is me debating a Funko Pop. And the Funko Pop it's actually a Nick Cage Funko Pop. So they actually make one. And the Funko Pop does impressions, and then I do an impression, and we go back and forth for about 20 minutes doing this to see who wins. And of course, the Funko Pop impressions are just me doing another impression, but it's as if anyway, it's this really bizarre and absurd type stuff. And then I smash the Funko Pop because I win. Sort of Gallagher style, like crushing it, right? So it's all very just wacky, bizarre stuff. But it was a vehicle for doing, you know, like 30 impressions in 20 minutes or so. So that was fun to do. But now I'm experimenting with other types of things. So I guess it just kind of naturally goes along with the Hollywood stuff too, right? Like,
of course,
if you're critiquing movies, right, you're gonna start talking like Nick Cage, you know, because you're talking about Nick Cage movies. So if you're it just, I don't know. It all just kind of meshed, I guess, with my personality.
The reason I thought of this, in addition to actually genuinely enjoying some of these skits, is even though you've been a little bit self-critical of the books you've published, if you go on public platforms, the ratings are quite high, but I wanted to see what was that tiny percentage of negative ratings. And it was very typical. It was either people using, you know, the term controversial and conspiracy theory without really explaining. Some of them are saying this is academic, which to me is, you know, a plus as opposed to a minus. You want something like this to go into detail. But a couple of people said this is too dark and depressing. And I was kind of thinking, what were you expecting? You know, butterflies and rainbows when you saw a title about, you know, Hollywood symbolism, and it had a very particular subtitle. So I thought it was really interesting how, to me, comedies, because you talk about difficult subjects that may not have an easy answer, an easy prediction, because it's a very broad systemic analysis. Comedy is one way to sort of, you know, make things a little bit lighter, even though your comedy may be kind of dark. It has a dark edge for sure, which is of course what makes it so good. So yeah, that's how I was looking at it. So I thought those reviews were very, very elucidating. I would have taken them as positives, even though people meant them to be negative. So why don't we, Marcelo, jump into some of the questions? I know there were a lot of questions when we first logged in, before Jay even came on the platform. So why don't we, wow, there are a lot of questions. Well, I know one person was asking, I hope Jay's not a libertarian. So I don't know if you want to address that. I know it seems like whenever there's, you know, a media personality and someone likes all these things about you, but there's going to be this one thing, and they're going to, I'm unsubscribing. I can't believe he endorsed such and such author. So Jay, are you in fact a libertarian? Which to me would be like a little bit strange, but.
No, I mean, we've done multiple debates with libertarians over the years. So first debate was Adam Kokesh in 2016. I debated another libertarian, Robert Taylor, in 2018. I did a debate with a libertarian, the Austin Peterson and I had a whole meltdown debate maybe a few months ago. And I'm sure there's been others. I don't even remember, but no, I think there's some pretty easy critiques. I made the same critiques of libertarianism for about 10 years. So I wrote an essay critiquing it, did some podcasts in 2014 critiquing it. And I would say most of my positions are the same as they were back then. I think libertarianism is really an Enlightenment philosophy tied to a lot of Enlightenment presuppositions that really don't give us a justification for ethical norms or, as we pointed out at the beginning of this conversation, freedom from what? Freedom to what? It's couched within what's called negative liberty, which is an Enlightenment idea of really the only role of the state is essentially to be this minimalist institution that enshrines liberty. But because of Enlightenment philosophy's anti-metaphysics stance, we're never really told what freedom is. Like, how do we have an account of that? What does this even mean? It's just a lot of assumed universal generalities that are never really explained. And that's, I guess, part of the heritage of the Enlightenment. And so it's not surprising to me that the stress for atomized individualistic liberty eventually collapses over into its dialectical opposite of pure collectivism. So I see those things as basically two irresolvable dialectical oppositions that are really just kind of managed and controlled. There is no easy answer to what society should be. I tend to favor more hierarchical monarchy type positions. I think is more sensible. But I mean, that doesn't mean I have like some answer to like, oh, well, America's going to be a monarchy next year. We'll convert it to the Byzantine Empire of America. That's all like, far-flung, fanciful nonsense. So there's just no easy answers to this. But no, I'm not a libertarian.
Well, thank you for being clear. To me, libertarianism is just a point in the trajectory of the development of liberalism. Maybe it's a little bit closer to classical liberalism, but exactly as you said, it's sort of freedom from all communal ties, right? So freedom from any sort of religious attachments to your community, and it does lead to being a more atomized society for sure.
Yes.
So Marcelo, do you want to pick out a few more questions? I'm scrolling. There's just a lot.
I'm actually would like to make one myself about
okay, well, there we go.
Latin America. I noticed that, but when I mentioned the Facebook thing and the events of 2014-15, he kind of got surprised that, perhaps not surprised, but expectable surprised about the use of social media and all that. But at the same time, you mentioned about Trump, Musk, all these people, and my question to you would be, if you pay attention to Latin America at some point, this is not it's a simple question, because I see that many people pay attention to Middle East, to Asia, to Eurasia, and all that, and Latin America, which is I'm not saying more or less important, it's just that it's a subject that it doesn't catch too much attention in the West. And I'm asking this not because, we need attention, all that. No, it's more that, for example, in the introduction of the channel of the Press of Mass Destruction, that is the other channel that is broadcasting, I used to have, Obama saying Assad must go, Clinton saying, we came, we saw, he's dead. And at some point, people say, you're only picking on Democrats. And then I have to search for something from Trump. And then I have this phrase from Trump a couple of years ago saying, Venezuela was there to catch and just go and catch. And they, dropped the ball with Biden coming to power. My question after all that would be, do you pay attention to movements from the United States establishment towards Latin America with this possible transition this year or not, or no transition this year with the elections, or is just, or you don't pay attention at all? It's okay. The answer can be that as well.
No, I mean, I try to pay attention as much as I can to these types of things. One of my really good friends, Tristan, lives in Ecuador. And Tristan, he regularly kind of updates us on Latin South American geopolitical stuff. He's very well read and well aware of all that stuff. I don't know a whole lot about that region. I read a couple books that dealt with like CIA operations in the Cold War down there, but beyond that kind of stuff, it's not an area I know a whole lot about. So I kind of go with what Tristan says, and he's usually pretty accurate. Like he says, for example, that he was saying a long time ago that Milei, for example, is very much just sort of a tool of the IMF and the Western banking structure. So this facade of sort of libertarianism is not really what he is. I know that there's some criticism of Bukele. I would say he seems to be a little better than the other ones. I do like Bitcoin. I'm not totally wedded to libertarianism, but I do think that Austrian economics and libertarians might be able to produce some good, useful things like Bitcoin. But that doesn't mean I adopt wholesale the philosophy. So I mean, it looks to me like Bukele has done some positive things. He might also have some of these ties and connections that I think all geopolitical, entanglements, politics is all about compromise. So there's always going to be these, compromised attachments that these people have. It's very hard to be a purist in politics. But I mean, I do remember reading about under Trump, right? Wasn't Pompeo trying to foster a CIA coup in Argentina? Was that a couple of years ago? Is that right? I remember reading about that.
I don't remember that.
I mean, so in other words, I try to keep up with some of this, but I don't know a whole lot of. I understand what you're saying about that region is really a very mineral resource rich region. It's very important. We're always told to focus on Middle East and I guess now Russia. Not dissing Middle East or Russia. I'm just saying that is an interesting question. Like, why are we're always focused on those regions, but.
I think it's because Americans implicitly think along the lines of the Monroe Doctrine, which initially was a defensive document, right? But by the time you got to Teddy Roosevelt and the corollary, where he essentially wanted to authorize military interventions for the sake of preserving order. And so Latin America has been viewed as the backyard of the United States, right? So it may not be as overtly presented as it had been in the past, even during the Cold War. But I think there is that kind of impression that this is our backyard, this is our sphere of influence. It's not even going to be questioned. And so perhaps this is why it's not discussed as much, unless it's someone who is sort of pushing the envelope in Venezuela, or obviously Cuba has been a thorn in the side for, right, exactly. So with the exception of these countries, I feel like it's not really being thought of, because it's just assumed that this is our backyard and these countries are going to do our bidding. At least that comes from my studies of U.S. foreign policy. But Latin America wasn't my focal point. I did look into where, for instance, the term banana republic comes from, the way that non-government entities like business, like large corporations, would essentially dominate the politics in certain countries because they were controlling the businesses. So that's kind of how I look at it. But maybe Jay is not as interested in the region because he's not a sort of a typical American in this regard.
No, I think both of answers are perfect about that. There is things cooking, and at the same time not so much. And I see that it is assumed it's under control. So let's not even talk about it. It's ours.
Well, do you guys remember maybe it was 2020. I remember I did a brief podcast on this because there was news stories coming out, and I'm pretty sure it was under Pompeo. And it was Trump and Pompeo were saying, we're going to have to, send troops, and we're going to have to fix the situation if we have to.
Is it the Guaido situation, perhaps? Are you thinking of the puppet leader Guaido? I'm not really sure. Is that what you're thinking of? Maybe.
I'm trying to find that article. Yes. I remember I printed out the article. I actually got it in my one of my Manila folders. I could probably find it, but I can't remember if it was.
We have a Putin here with Manila folders.
Anyway, it's the point was just that's the last thing I remember about reading about. I'm pretty sure it was Pompeo trying to say we gotta we got to ensure democracy, and I thought it was Argentina, but maybe it was Brazil. I can't remember, but they were talking about like sending black ops soldiers in to help with some sort of a coup. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is just I don't.
It's happened so many times we're confused about the country.
Yeah.
Well, I'm looking at the question, and this is a very general question. I think we sort of touched upon it. How, is the matrix true or not? How do we resist these changes? I mean, other than being aware of them, I'm not sure if there's much that we can do. But
by matrix being true, like, do you mean, do we live in a simulation? I don't think we live in a simulation. I mean.
But in terms of sort of these elites imposing certain agenda onto, the population, which may or may not be aware of this agenda. I think now it might be a little bit more, as you mentioned, but is there a way to resist these changes? Like you're talking about the technocratic control, lack of, I'm just thinking this is what you were probably meant.
I mean, the ways that I see
societies, et cetera.
Yeah, the ways I guess I suggest people in America, I don't know the situation in other places, how feasible a lot of these options might be, but I think the best ways to resist are, things like not living in the giant mega cities. I think those are going to get worse and worse. I think you're going to have more and more restrictions and tyranny in those places, especially in America, the blue cities. I think you should try to get onto the land if you can. A lot of people in America are homesteading. That's becoming more and more popular. So, elements of, I don't think we have to be paranoid and freaked out, but elements of prepping are good, like, having your own source of food and that kind of stuff if you can. I recommend being in an Orthodox church if you can find one that's solid, not that doesn't promote globalist ideas. I think having gold, Bitcoin, having self-defense means, all of those are things I would recommend to fight back. Oh, this is an overlooked thing too, is especially in America, like we're really bad about trying to save a buck and basically giving all kinds of energy and power to the Fortune 100, Fortune 500. The main enemy, your main enemies are not in Russia, they're not in some other country. It's the Fortune 100, Fortune 500 that are your main enemies, and that's the key locus of control. You'll notice, for example, in the last 4 years when COOF happened, in lockstep, all of the Fortune 100 operated in perfect unity. Why? Right. So I think that's an even more dangerous opponent, and so as best you can, and by all means that you can, divest from giving anything to Bezos and the Fortune 100. So if you can shop locally, those are key ways. I mean, everybody gives up so much for convenience and immediacy, to these entities that are working consistently for human enslavement. It's just crazy.
That sounds fair. Marcelo, do you want to pick maybe one or two more questions before we wrap this up?
No.
There's just a lot of compliments here.
I went around and couldn't find anything that I found interesting, at least.
Yeah, there's a lot of compliments for you, which is great. But I think people are just kind of commenting on what we are discussing. All right. Well, why don't you, Jay, introduce any of your more recent projects that people can follow? Obviously, I'm sure people who are here probably already follow you, but for the sake of the newcomers, and then we can wrap this up.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, we'll be live in Las Vegas, June 22nd. So anybody in the Utah, Vegas, Arizona, even California region, if they want to, New Mexico, whatever, if they want to make the trip, it's kind of a mini conference. So we do pretty lengthy live events. They're about 6 hours on average. We usually bring in some other friends of ours to do either comedy or speaking. The last several events we've had Jamie Kennedy from Scream. He comes and he does stand up. He's not able to be at this event, but I've called two of my other friends. They're going to be doing presentations. So we do a little Hollywood, we do a little geopolitics, we do some comedy, we do some film analysis, deep dives. Jamie, my wife, will be speaking. So that'll be June 22nd. You get the tickets on my Twitter at the Eventbrite link. I think I'll be hosting Lord Voldemort tomorrow everything is up in the air. I think he finds out tomorrow what the judge decides about the future of his operation. So hopefully, Lord willing, that will continue and won't be closed. Of course, he'll reemerge and continue to do podcasts if so. But a lot of cool, good people over there that work at that operation would have to find new work if that happens. So we'll find out tomorrow. Let's see what else. Working on Esoteric Hollywood 3, so that'll be out hopefully in the next year. I've got about 200 pages of it now. So usually they're about 350, 400 pages, so it's almost half. So you can get these at my website, the signed copies of the earlier books. I got a couple philosophy books that you can get in the shop as well. And I've been lecturing lately through some really fascinating texts like the Jacques Attali text. I'm ready to do the part 2 for that. We just did a big 2-part lecture on the history of sex espionage. That was fascinating. I've been doing talks on Whitney Webb's books as well, which is also sex espionage. So we always kind of continue all of these things, kind of, the next global elite text is the Attali one. And then I don't know which one I'll do next after that. I might do Harari's Homo Deus, his transhumanist text. Or I might even get into something a little edgier like Kalergi's book. So that one is a hot topic. So we'll see.
Well, thank you for giving us an overview of your work. Sounds like you're very busy, but would love to have you back here maybe to discuss something more specific, because today was kind of an introduction to a lot of different things you do. So
sure, anytime.
That sounds amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming, Jay. Thank you for watching, everyone. And Marcelo, any final parting words?
Yeah, sure.
Subscribe, push all the buttons, bell notifications, Twitter.
Thank you very much, Jay, for coming. It was a pleasure to meet you. Thank you again, Nina. We're gonna see you again next week. Everybody, the links are on the description. Jay, I don't have all the links. Perhaps if you send Nina your books links, I can put them on the description as well, and your shops and everything. I have your channel and the Twitter, but I'm going to put everything else so we can go.
All connected, much like the things we've discussed
all connected.
Today. So.
Exactly. We have to beat them in their own game. That's the thing. Thank you, everybody, for coming again. And I'm going to see you next week and see you guys.
Next week. Thank you,
guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.